The general picture of the whole townscape that emerges is one which is less orderly, less planned, less, I think you say, stereotyped and normalised, less of those things than we conventionally think. There's more sort of random human variability in your picture of Pompeii than the one we sort of conventionally are used to.
Yeah, I think Pompeii was an awful mess. We tend to think that Roman towns are frightfully well organised and they've got a very elaborate and grid pattern of their streets, and in part that's true. But I think the more you look at Pompeii, the more you repopulate it. It's fine to go around this grid pattern now and there's nobody there apart from the other tourists. But if you actually repopulate it with people living and working there, it is smelly and it's dirty, and there are people kind of in places where they're not supposed to be on the kind of grand stereotypical model. I mean, one very obvious case that I talk about in the book is, where did people sleep? Now, we think people sleep in bedrooms. Go to Pompeii, look, do these houses have bedrooms? Well, unless they were upstairs, which is possible, but there are quite serious reasons for thinking it isn't likely. There aren't any designated bedrooms, really. And so you suddenly see that the inside of a Pompeian house, and that's perhaps the easiest way of understanding this, is not the kind of ordered, neat place with separate functions going on in different places. But you've got couches, and sometimes in the day you sit on the couch, and then you might go to bed on the couch. And they're in little rooms that are sort of, don't fit our designation. They're not living rooms and they're not bedrooms, they're kind of both. And you think, well, okay, so suppose I walked through a house at Pompeii at night. What would I find? Well, okay, there'd be some people off on these couches, but I suppose you'd find the slaves just bedded down on the floor, probably. And it's all a bit more improvised, a bit more kind of, messy, I think, in both in a literal sense. I mean, it probably was dirty. I mean, where did they put all their rubbish? On the street, I bet. But also messy in terms of being less orderly than we'd like it to be. I mean, another thing you get told when you go to Pompeii is, you go to a bath building, big public bath building, and you'll get a plan, and it'll tell you that they all went round the same way. First of all, you went into the frigidarium, the cold room, then you went into the tepidarium, the warm room, and then the caldarium, the hot room. And so you get these kind of normative paths round the building, and you go and look at this and you think, well, why didn't they why did they go to the frigidarium first? Maybe some people did, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt for a bit of kind of initiative, autonomy, initiative, and you could wander around. These aren't, you could go back to the tepidarium after you'd been in the hot room, and so on. And I really did think that as soon as you put the people back in, and you say, and you get them living in there, none of it is quite so orderly and rigid and kind of Roman. We kind of like to think of the Romans as, never doing anything out of order. I thought they were doing that all the time.
In a late chapter in the book, you come to belief and you say, if a native of Pompeii could have read this book, they would have been surprised that I've left belief to so late in the book, because it was a city full of gods, is the way you describe it.
Yeah. Religion's another tough nut to crack for understanding the ancient world. It's difficult to understand what's going on religiously. That's partly because you go around the city, you walk around, and there are some buildings called temples, and you go into houses and you will be pointed out things that are called domestic shrines. And the problem is that's easy enough, so you can kind of plot where religion happens, in a way, in Pompeii, but you haven't got the foggiest clue what went on in them. And that, I think, is really hard to know. I mean, some basic things are very important and very different from what we expect. That's to say, most temples, not absolutely all, but most temples of the traditional civic official religion of Pompeii were houses for a god. They house a statue of a god. They're not like churches, in other words. You don't go there to worship. It's a house for a god. If you do any worship there, what it is sacrifice, and it happens outside. So we kind of I think, look at Roman temples and somehow make them into churches with a kind of congregational image, or synagogues for that matter. But that's quite different. And the Roman function of most temples was very different from that. And it was God's house, really. In fact, the Latin for temple is actually ides, which means house, much more commonly used than templum. All the same, it's more complicated than that. And I think what's interesting about Pompeii, and what you see sort of starting in Pompeii, is signs of different versions of what religious ritual and religious belief is going to turn out to be. Now, there are no Christians in Pompeii, as far as we can see. I mean, St. Paul did go via South Italy when he went up to Rome to be executed, but there's never been found any firm evidence of any Christian community there. There are some clear evidence of some Jews, though no synagogue. What you can see, however, is you can see the beginning of different forms of religious experience, like, particularly most famous of all at Pompeii, is the worship of Isis. Back into the 18th century, one of the first buildings discovered, Mozart visited it, everybody visited it, was the Temple of Isis, an Egyptian deity who in some way had come to Italy and taken root within the Roman religious world, but interestingly offering a rather different form of religious experience. And I think it is pretty clear that whereas the cult of Jupiter, the Temple of Jupiter in the Forum at Pompeii, that's absolutely standard Roman temple, no congregational worship here, no nice priest who'll look after you and have a kind of pastoral view of his flock. Go to the Temple of Isis, and there you'll find something much more familiar to us in religious terms. You'll find a community, you'll find priests who in a sense look after their community. So I think why it's difficult but also interesting when you look at the religious experience in Pompeii is you get kind of these different models, and of course actually religious experience is, at the moment Pompeii is destroyed, on the change. And the kind of version that we're going to take for granted of what a religion is, which is kind of consequence of personal belief and built around a community, a religious community of believers, is just beginning to come into view with the Temple of Isis. So I think it's very, very hard. And as for what people did in their household shrines, heaven only knows. I mean, we have a kind of slightly Victorian picture of them, I think. Everybody gets up for family prayers in the morning at the household shrine with the paterfamilias, the father of the family. Whether anybody worshipped at all anything at them, whether some of them, I always suspect, were shelves, not shrines anyway, but people always want to have a shrine in a house, so any little ledge will do. So it is very, very complicated. But also I think Pompeii is a nice case study of the complexities, but also the changes that are going on in the just pre-Christian world. St. Paul might have gone to Pompeii, he probably didn't, but he might have.